Three American destroyers just transited the Strait of Hormuz under sustained Iranian fire. Every missile was knocked down, every drone was incinerated. The fast attack boats that swarmed them went to the bottom of the sea. And then the United States did something it had not done since the ceasefire began. It struck Iran. Not a warning, not a diplomatic protest. Actual strikes on Iranian soil, on Iranian military infrastructure at Bandar Abbas and Qeshm Island. The twin nerve centers of the IRGC's entire naval operation in the strait. This was the first time American firepower had directly hit targets inside Iran since Operation Epic Fury was declared concluded. This direct engagement on Iranian soil represents a significant escalation, departing from previous U.S. strategies that often favored proxy responses or economic sanctions over overt military action within Iran's borders. It signals a notable shift in Washington's red lines. And the question that the entire world is now asking is whether this marks the collapse of the ceasefire, the resumption of full-scale war, or something altogether more extraordinary. Welcome to States News. What just happened over the past 72 hours is one of the most consequential sequences of events since this conflict began. By the time you finish watching this video, you will understand every layer of what is happening. The military exchanges, the diplomatic race against time, the Chinese tanker incident that no one saw coming, and the extraordinary one-page document that could end this war entirely. This situation is moving by the hour, and you need to be here for every development. Let's start from the very beginning of this sequence, because the strikes on Bandar Abbas did not come out of nowhere. They were the product of weeks of accumulating American frustration and a pattern of concessions that was quietly making Washington's closest Gulf allies increasingly furious. Since the ceasefire was announced on April 7th, a clear and troubling pattern had been developing. Let's walk through it step by step because the context is everything. When Operation Epic Fury was in full swing, President Trump made a series of increasingly vivid public threats. He promised to destroy Iran's economic infrastructure if the regime did not reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Iran did not open the strait. The campaign against economic targets was paused anyway. Concession number 1. On April 7th, Trump announced a ceasefire. One of the explicit conditions of that ceasefire was that Iran would allow commercial shipping to resume through the strait. Iran did not reopen it. The ceasefire was granted anyway. Concession number 2. On April 13th, following the collapse of the Islamabad talks and Iran's continued stranglehold on the waterway, the U.S. Navy began blockading Iranian ports. That was meaningful pressure. But Iran still did not open the strait. Then, this past Sunday, came Project Freedom, the limited operation to begin escorting commercial vessels out of the Persian Gulf. As documented by CBS News and confirmed by CENTCOM, Iran responded by attacking ships in the strait and launching 15 ballistic missiles and 4 drones at the UAE. Those strikes ignited a refinery in Fujairah, wounded Indian nationals, forced 4 missile alerts in the Emirates, turned commercial flights back mid-air, and shut schools down across the country for the week. And what was the American response to those UAE attacks? Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane publicly characterized the Iranian strikes on the UAE as not a major attack. From the UAE's perspective, that framing was deeply unsatisfying. 15 ballistic missiles crossing its airspace. The country that had explicitly stayed out of the war, denied the U.S. access to its bases for offensive operations, and done everything possible to remain neutral, was not a minor incident. It was an assault on their sovereignty during a supposed ceasefire. According to the analysis of this situation, both the UAE and Saudi Arabia expected a strong American response to Iran's ceasefire breach. The response did not come, and that non-response left a mark on some of the most critical relationships the United States maintains in the Gulf region. This is the background against which May 7th must be understood. On the morning of May 7th, 3 U.S. Navy guided missile destroyers, the USS Truckton, the USS Mason, and the USS Rafael Peralta, were transiting the Strait of Hormuz when Iranian forces launched a coordinated and sustained assault. Multiple missiles, combat drones, and a swarm of fast attack boats converged on the American vessel simultaneously. According to reporting by multiple U.S. officials cited by CBS News, under conditions of anonymity, The engagement on May 7th was fiercer and more sustained than the Iranian barrage those same ships had faced only 3 days earlier. American warships opened fire on the attacking boats with 5-inch naval guns. The close-in weapon system, the CIWS, an automated rotary cannon specifically designed to destroy incoming projectiles at point-blank range, was activated. Small-caliber gun teams engaged attacking boats directly from the deck. H-64 Apache attack helicopters fired Hellfire missiles. 50 caliber machine guns were deployed. Additional aircraft provided overhead support. Over several hours, the 3 destroyers fought their way through the strait. Not a single American vessel was struck. Every missile was knocked down. Every drone was neutralized. The fast attack boats that attempted to close on the American ships were destroyed. U.S. Central Command issued its statement immediately. U.S. forces intercepted unprovoked Iranian attacks and responded with self-defense strikes as U.S. Navy guided missile destroyers transited the Strait of Hormuz to the Gulf of Oman on May 7th. Iranian forces launched multiple missiles, drones, and small boats as the USS Truckton, USS Rafael Peralta, and USS Mason transited the international sea passage. No U.S. assets were struck, and CENTCOM listed what it hit in return. Iranian military facilities responsible for attacking U.S. forces, including missile and drone launch sites, command and control locations, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance nodes. According to PBS NewsHour, citing a U.S. official with knowledge of the strikes, the targeted facilities included the port area of Bandar Abbas, a loading dock, and a military garrison. Across the water, Qeshm Island was struck, and farther east along the coast, Minab was also targeted. Fox News, which reported the Qeshm and Bandar Abbas strikes first, was confirmed by multiple additional U.S. officials within hours. Trump posted his own account on Truth Social. 3 world-class American destroyers just transited very successfully out of the Strait of Hormuz under fire. There was no damage done to the 3 destroyers, but great damage done to the Iranian attackers. They were completely destroyed, along with numerous small boats, which are being used to take the place of their fully decapitated navy. These boats went to the bottom of the sea, quickly and efficiently. Missiles were shot at our destroyers and were easily knocked down. Likewise, drones came and were incinerated while in the air. They dropped ever so beautifully down to the ocean, very much like a butterfly dropping to its grave. A normal country would have allowed these destroyers to pass, he added. Iran is not a normal country. They are led by lunatics. Then, speaking to a television journalist about whether the ceasefire was still in effect despite striking Iranian facilities, Trump said, "Yeah, it is. They trifled with us today. We blew them away. I call that a trifle. I'll let you know when there's no ceasefire. If there's no ceasefire, you're not going to have to know. You're just going to have to look at one big blow coming out of Iran, and they better sign their agreement fast." A love tap, he called it separately. The strikes on Bandar Abbas were, in Trump's framing, a love tap, a proportionate self-defense response that does not, in Washington's legal and diplomatic reading, constitute a resumption of war. The ceasefire remains technically in effect. The strikes happened anyway. Both things are true simultaneously. Before we get into the extraordinary diplomatic situation playing out in parallel with all of this military escalation, there is one more story from this week that needs its own dedicated treatment, because it is simultaneously the most ironic and the most geopolitically significant incident of the entire week. Iran accidentally struck a Chinese tanker. This is States News. What happened with the Chinese tanker has implications for the entire diplomatic architecture of this conflict. On May 4th, the Chinese chemical tanker JV Innovation reported a fire on board to other vessels near the UAE port of Mina Sakur. According to Caixin, the widely respected Chinese financial and investigative news outlet, this was the first time a Chinese-owned vessel had been struck by Iranian fire since the conflict began on February 28th. A source at the shipowner's company told Caixin the attack was, in their words, psychologically very hard to accept. That framing is dense with meaning. Let's unpack it. Since the conflict began, China had been threading one of the most delicate strategic needles imaginable. Beijing depends on Iranian oil for a significant share of its energy imports, mostly routed through shadow fleet tankers that move crude under the radar of U.S. sanctions enforcement. At the same time, China has no interest in being drawn into direct military confrontation with the United States, and it has absolutely no interest in having its commercial fleet put at physical risk in the world's most dangerous waterway. For weeks, the strategy appeared to be working. Iranian state media had even reported in early March that Tehran would allow Chinese, Russian, Indian, Pakistani, and Iraqi vessels to transit the strait, extending diplomatic cover to countries it considered aligned with its interests. Chinese ships were moving, Chinese oil was flowing, the implicit arrangement was holding. The JV innovation shattered that arrangement. According to U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Mike Waltz, speaking publicly and on the record, Iran conducted the attack on the Chinese tanker. This official attribution by a senior U.S. diplomat is highly unusual, as Washington often avoids directly naming perpetrators in such sensitive incidents without overwhelming public evidence. It underscores the U.S. intent to isolate Iran diplomatically and highlight its perceived recklessness. Waltz made sure the accusation was public, attributed, and formal. Now here is the layer that makes this incident genuinely remarkable. The same night the Chinese tanker was struck, May 4th into May 5th, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi flew to Beijing to meet with his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi. He went to China to ask for Beijing's support in the ongoing negotiations. He went to strengthen what Tehran officially calls its strategic partnership with the People's Republic of China. He arrived in Beijing the day after Iranian projectiles had just put a Chinese civilian ship on fire. Wang Yi, meeting with Araghchi, publicly called for an immediate end to hostilities and urged both the U.S. and Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz as quickly as possible. He endorsed Iran's right to national sovereignty and dignity. Those are the diplomatic formalities. But the message embedded in that meeting, the fact that Wang raised the Hormuz reopening prominently, the fact that China's trade flows were visibly suffering, the fact that a Chinese tanker had just been struck was unmistakable. Beijing wants this war over, and it is now willing to say so directly to Tehran. Here is the dimension of this incident that deserves special attention. According to reports during the early phase of the conflict, China had previously supplied Iran with anti-ship missile technology. That technology was provided, presumably, with the expectation that it would be deployed against American or Western commercial and military shipping. There is now a legitimate and widely asked question. Was Chinese-supplied missile technology used to strike a Chinese-owned civilian tanker? Iran has not claimed or denied the attack. U.S. officials have attributed it to Iranian forces. And whatever the ultimate forensics show, the strategic damage is done. The Chinese brand of neutrality in the strait has been compromised. The unspoken guarantee that Chinese ships would be spared has evaporated. And Beijing's willingness to serve as Tehran's quiet diplomatic backstop, already strained by the sheer economic cost of the Hormuz closure to China, has been complicated by the most awkward friendly fire incident of the entire war. And here is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary, because running in parallel with all of these military exchanges, the destroyer transit, the Bandar Abbas strikes, the Chinese tanker is a diplomatic process that may be days away from ending this war. According to an Axios report published on May 6th and confirmed in substance by Reuters, Time magazine, and the Times of Israel, citing their own independent sources, the White House believes it is closer to a deal with Iran than at any moment since the conflict began. The vehicle for that deal is a one-page, 14-point Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU, being crafted by Trump's top diplomatic envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, in coordination with Iranian officials, with Pakistan serving as the central mediator. The U.S. had given Iran a 48-hour window to respond to the key points in the MOU. That window was due to expire roughly around the time you are watching this video. What does the document actually contain? According to Axios, Time and the Times of Israel, reporting on sources directly briefed on the negotiations, Iran would commit to a moratorium on nuclear enrichment, the duration being actively negotiated, with Iran proposing 5 years, the U.S. demanding 20, and the emerging compromise landing around 12 to 15 years. Iran would commit never to develop a nuclear weapon, a public position it has long maintained but never formalized. In this context, Iran would agree to remove its highly enriched uranium from its territory, a concession it had previously categorically rejected. According to two sources cited by Axios, one option being discussed is the transfer of that material to the United States itself. The potential removal of such a substantial quantity of highly enriched uranium is a critical breakthrough, far exceeding concessions seen in past nuclear negotiations. This single provision could fundamentally alter the regional security calculus and de-escalate immediate proliferation fears. Iran would commit not to operate underground nuclear facilities subject to an enhanced inspections regime, including SNAP UN inspector access. On the economic side, the U.S. would commit to gradually lifting sanctions and releasing billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets held around the world. And on the Strait of Hormuz, both sides would simultaneously and gradually wind down their competing blockades. Iran lifting its shipping restrictions, the U.S. lifting its blockade of Iranian ports, allowing the waterway to return to full commercial function over a 30-day negotiating period. Secretary of State Marco Rubio put the diplomatic framework clearly in a Tuesday briefing. We don't have to have the actual agreement written in one day. This is highly complex and technical, but we have to have a diplomatic solution that is very clear on the topics they are willing to negotiate on and the extent of the concessions they are willing to make at the front end. Speaking at a military families event at the White House on May 6th, Trump said the talks are going very well. He said Iran wants to make a deal badly. He said, if we get there, they can't have nuclear weapons. And he added the now familiar ultimatum. If it doesn't get signed, they're going to have a lot of pain. Speaking to PBS the following day, Trump said the war has a very good chance of ending. But if it doesn't end, we have to go back to bombing the hell out of them. But before we get there, let's bring in one more dimension of the MOU that is rarely getting the attention it deserves. Because the structure of this deal, if it holds, represents not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a fundamentally new relationship between Washington and Tehran. And the stakes on both sides of that table are enormous. Iran would, under the terms being negotiated, be agreeing to remove approximately 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium from its territory. That is the material that has been at the center of every Western security concern about Iran's nuclear program for the better part of 2 decades. Getting Tehran to ship that material out of the country, whether to the US, Russia, or a third neutral party, eliminates the most immediate risk of nuclear breakout capability. According to US officials briefed on the talks, once Iran's highly enriched uranium is removed from Iranian soil, the timeline for any potential Iranian nuclear weapon goes from weeks to years. That is the single most important security outcome the United States is seeking from this entire conflict. Iran's supreme leadership is, according to US officials cited by Time magazine, of 2 minds. The hardliners, particularly within the IRGC, believe the regime can sustain the pressure longer than Washington is willing to maintain it. They point to Trump's stated desire to wrap this up in 4 to 6 weeks, his historical reluctance to return to major combat operations, and the pattern of American concessions since April 7th. The moderates, those around President Pezeshkian and his economic team, look at the collapsing rial, the full oil storage, the unaffordable soldier salaries, and the decade of economic recovery that lies ahead, and see the MOU as a lifeline that the regime would be irrational to refuse. The fundamental question is, which faction of the Iranian leadership gets to make the final call before the 48-hour window closes? Here is the honest picture of where the negotiations actually stand. Because the diplomatic optimism from Washington is real, but so are the friction points on the Iranian side. According to Al Jazeera's reporting from Tehran and analysis by King's College London's Associate Professor Andreas, Washington appears to have moved toward Iran's long-standing position on one fundamental structural question, the sequencing. For months, the U.S. had insisted on resolving the war in Hormuz and the nuclear program together in a single, comprehensive package. Iran had been arguing for a multi-stage approach, end the war first, negotiate on nuclear issues separately over time. The 14-point MOU as currently structured appears to accept the multi-stage logic. The war ends now. The nuclear details get resolved over 30 days of formal negotiation. That is a significant American concession, one that many Iran hawks in Washington have noted with concern. Iran's public posture remains hardened. Foreign Minister Araghchi said Tehran would only accept a fair and comprehensive agreement. Iranian officials told Al Jazeera the nuclear enrichment program is a non-negotiable red line, and Iran has not stayed passive during the diplomatic window. On May 5th, Tehran formally established what it called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, a new bureaucratic body claiming the legal right to authorize maritime transit through the waterway and collect fees from vessels seeking passage. Countries involved in the war were told they would need to pay reparations before receiving transit permits. A senior Iranian lawmaker told Al Jazeera that the balance of deterrence is currently skewed in Iran's favor. That is a remarkable claim to make. The same week, Iranian boats were sunk, Iranian drone launch sites were struck, and Iranian missiles failed to hit a single American warship. Let's be absolutely clear about the military reality. As of today, 3 U.S. Navy destroyers transited the Strait of Hormuz under Iran's most intense post-ceasefire assault and emerged without damage. Iran's missile and drone attacks failed completely. Iranian fast attack boats were destroyed. U.S. forces struck Iranian military infrastructure at Bandar Abbas, Qeshm, and Minab. CENTCOM has confirmed it remains positioned and ready to protect American forces. The naval blockade of Iranian ports is still fully in effect, with no signs of relaxation. 15,000 U.S. troops remain in the region. Nuclear-powered submarines are still in position in the deep waters of the Arabian Sea. Over 100 American warplanes are still rotating through combat patrols. The economic pressure continues its relentless work. The rial is in free fall. Oil storage is near capacity. Wells may need to be shut in at potentially decade-long cost to the underground reservoirs. Soldiers are not being paid. The Iranian economy is projected to shrink by over 6% in 2026, with inflation near 70%. Iran's central bank governor has reportedly urged the president to sign a deal urgently. Senior economic officials have warned that recovery could take more than a decade. Trump's ultimatum on the MOU is explicit. In a post on Truth Social on May 6th, he wrote, "Operation Epic Fury will be at an end if Iran agrees to give what has been agreed to," which is perhaps a big assumption. If that happened, the U.S. naval blockade would allow the Hormuz Strait to be open to all, including Iran. But if they don't agree, the bombing starts, and it will be sadly at a much higher level in intensity than it was before. That is the equation. The 2 destroyers going through the strait, the strikes on Bandar Abbas, the 48-hour window on the MOU, all of it happening simultaneously. A war that may be ending or about to get significantly worse. The ceasefire is technically still in place. Iran called the Bandar Abbas strikes a ceasefire violation. Washington called them self-defense. Both sides are still not shooting at full scale, and a 1-page document with 14 points is sitting in diplomatic channels between Islamabad, Washington, and Tehran, waiting for a signature or for the next escalation. But here's the thing that every observer of this conflict needs to internalize. The trajectory of power in this confrontation has been moving in one direction since February 28th. Iran started with a navy, an air force, missile infrastructure, and the ability to threaten the strait. It has lost all but the strait itself, and even that is now being contested successfully by American destroyers. Iran started with the ability to charge vessels $1 million per transit and claim authority over international waters. It is now watching those same vessels pass under American military escort, arriving safely on the other side, while the boats sent to stop them sink. The MOU is Tehran's best available exit from a situation that gets worse for the Iranian regime with every passing week. The moratorium on enrichment, the inspection regime, the removal of the highly enriched uranium stockpile, these are significant concessions. But the alternative to those concessions is not the status quo. The alternative, as Trump has made clear, is a return to bombing at a much higher level and intensity than before. Iran's parliament speaker is calling for unity. Its central bank governor is urging the president to sign. Its economic officials are warning of a decade of recovery. Its soldiers are not being paid. The 48-hour clock ran. Now we find out what Iran chose. We will keep you updated the moment anything breaks on the MOU, on the negotiations, or on military developments in the Strait. This conflict has moved faster and with more dramatic pivots than any geopolitical crisis in recent memory. And the next 48 hours could bring either a formal end to the war or the most intense escalation since Epic Fury. States News will be here to break it down for you, regardless of which direction it goes. One more thing worth noting as this video closes. The pattern of Iranian propaganda in this conflict has been consistent and by now entirely predictable. Iranian state media claim to have shot down 30 B-2 stealth bombers, aircraft the US does not even possess in that quantity. Iranian officials claimed their missiles struck a US Navy frigate in the Strait, a class of vessel the Navy decommissioned in 2015. Iranian social media accounts circulated AI-generated images as supposed evidence of military victories that never happened. On May 7th, the IRGC-affiliated Tasnim News reported that U.S. destroyers were fleeing toward the Sea of Oman after taking significant damage. CENTCOM's statement confirmed no U.S. assets were struck. Trump's own post confirmed the ships transited safely. The destroyers are currently back on blockade duty. This matters not just as a historical footnote to this conflict, but as a live intelligence problem, because Iran's leadership, much of it sheltering in bunkers across the country, may genuinely be receiving distorted information about how its forces are performing. The gap between what the IRGC is telling its commanders and what is actually happening on the water could be significant. And a regime that has convinced itself it is winning a war it is losing is a regime that may make decisions that accelerate its own destruction. That is perhaps the most dangerous dimension of the current moment. Not the military exchange, not even the nuclear file, but the possibility that Tehran's hardliners, fed a diet of fabricated victories and propaganda, will mistake this diplomatic window for weakness and let it close. Whatever happens next, States News will have it covered. We are watching all of it in real time.